Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, what makes a robot intelligent? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week we're diving into a fascinating field of research where neuroscience, philosophy, and robotics meet. To find out about the basic ingredients for intelligent, lifelike behaviour in artificial systems. Before that, please remember to like or rate this episode and leave us a review if that's something you can do on the platform you're listening on. And don't forget to share the podcast on social media or tell your friends about it. It really helps us reach more listeners, so thank you in advance. So, with all that said, it's time for me to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a great conversation with Estelle Raffy from the University of Bristol, all about animal behaviour, intelligence, and lifelike artificial systems. This week, I'm speaking to Estelle Raffy, a PhD student at the University of Bristol, researching the fundamental and necessary ingredients for lifelike artificial systems. Hi Estelle, great to have you on the podcast.
Hi Claire, thank you very much for having me.
So, like me, you have not taken the most traditional route into the field of robotics. So your undergraduate degree was in neuroscience and cognitive science, and you then went on to do a master's degree in philosophy and the history of science. So how did this background lead you to start a PhD in robotics?
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful to say, but yeah, as you just said, yeah, I was in neuroscience and cognitive science for my Bachelor, and basically in my final year, we have to do that dissertation project, which is basically a first research project. And I was quite excited about it because at the time I was interested in embodied intelligence, which is basically how the type of body that you have is shaping how you behave. And in neuroscience, we like to think about it as how brain and bodies actually have co-evolved together to lead to amazing adaptive behavior in animals. So we usually look at very typical example of animals like vertebrates, for instance, monkeys are very commonly used because they have a very super clear body structure. So it's quite easy. But I was actually thinking about the kind of animals that I was interested in. And one day I was on a holiday and my stepfather and me, we went to an aquarium and it was that octopus in his tank. And my stepdad had a video of a spinning carousel on his phone. And he showed that to the octopus and the octopus got super interested. He just jumped at it, had a look at it, and then he just returned to his den. And my stepfather tried to play the same trick on it a couple minutes later, and the octopus didn't even move. So he knew that there was something there that was not super interesting for him to look at. And that got me thinking, because I just said to myself, okay, what about octopus embodied intelligence? How could we basically study embodiment from the perspective of a system that is evidently smart, and we know that there's a lot of research on it, but has an infinite motor flexibility and not even a clear shape or body? So embodiment is basically what can the body do for the brain? But in that situation, you could ask yourself, well, what is left for the brain to do for the body? So my journey really started with this octopus, and I like to say that. And after that, I basically got interested about these unusual cases of embodied intelligence and how that can change how you understand cognition and minds and even consciousness. So I went into philosophy. I did a master in philosophy and I wanted to get into these fundamental questions. For instance, what is really the role of the body on the mind? But I couldn't really find a clear answer. Very disappointing. I had my hopes up and I couldn't really answer that questions because there are lots of debates on just what the body is, where it starts or ends, what does it include. So I found more interesting to show that there is something useful that embodied intelligence can tell us. It can give us research direction, design principles that we can test and then advance our understanding of intelligence. And that's what I did in my master thesis. I used a lot of robotics example because to me, and that's the reason I went to robotics is a sandbox. It's the perfect meeting point of brain, body, and environment because we design both the brain and the body and we have them interact with the environment, which is amazing for embodied intelligence. So, since then I've been trying to find clever structures that I can leverage and build that intelligence from the bottom up.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. I think obviously as humans, we're always sort of stuck in our own frame of reference, right? Like we understand how brains work and how our bodies work based on our own. And it's really hard to imagine like what it would be like to be an octopus, what they experience, how they interact with the world. It's so alien and so different from us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a scientist once said that because the octopus had almost like 9 brains and its arms can basically have their own like sensory motor programs, like trying to imagine how it is to be an octopus would be to imagine like almost a psychedelic fragmented experience or a schizophrenic experience. So, it's really, we're not very well calibrated to recognize intelligence that are not in all like 3D human space.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I can see the appeal of robotics because it really allows you to kind of build something up from scratch and see what behaviors can emerge from different kind of configurations, I guess.
Exactly. Yes.
So your PhD is focused on finding the necessary ingredients for adaptive lifelike behavior in artificial systems. Can you tell me about some of the robots you've been developing to explore these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know these are very blue sky questions. And I think the first thing is, how do you define life? And that's a really hard question. And I'm not about to give you an answer. I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
I'm not yet at the end of my PhD. And even then, I'm not sure I'll have an answer. But basically, to me, as I understand it, life is something that reacts. If you poke something that's alive, I would expect that thing to respond, even if it's not on the same time scale as humans. But it's something that is able to adapt to changes in the environment. And sometimes that also involves changes in the system itself, like metabolic changes or making decisions. And it is usually to reach a goal or keep that system in a very happy state. And we call that homeostasis. And of course, brains do that. But if you think about bodies again, they're very good at doing that. Because some bodies actually even regenerate. There is like a species of flatworm. If you cut them into very small pieces, they will regenerate. And we know this is not because they have a very intelligent brain or a centralized system that allows that. It is completely distributed. And that's back to the octopus, right? It inspired me to think about decentralized and collective intelligence. But obviously making an octopus is a bit of a tedious task. So I thought, okay, what about starting at the very bottom with even like a single cell? Because we know that cells are able to react to environment and tune their responses in a very adaptive way for the emergence of like fantastic behaviors like growing, spreading, or even dying. So the question actually that I asked myself at the very start was, how can I make the architecture for lifelike behavior? And if I start with one cell, what is it made of? So I looked at the architecture of a cell and I found that cell has a cytoskeleton. It's basically the machinery of the cell that allows its good functioning. And that cytoskeleton is basically made of what we call the tensegrity structure. Okay. So here I'm going to ask for a bit of imagination because it's not very easy to describe. Basically, it's a network of very rigid sticks or rods that connected by stretched elements like a rubber cord. Okay. And these elements basically push and pull against each other. And together they create a very stable and very flexible form. So if you visualize it, actually it looks a bit like a ball of spider web. And if you apply pressure to it, it will deform and you can even flatten it completely. But if you let go, it actually springs back to its original shape. And that's interesting because tensegrity actually does 2 things. Thanks to that, the cell maintains its integrity, which is basically homeostasis. And because of the push and pull forces, it means that that cell is always stressed. It's a bit like a violin string. It's already wired to respond immediately to perturbations. And the second thing is, it does not just respond mechanically. The forces that you apply on it, they get integrated as information, as cues, and these cues are going to trigger changes in the cell so that the cell can make the decision of growing, spreading, or even to die. So that's basically changing the system's goal or its happy boundaries. And to use that violin image again, by playing one string of the violin, you're actually changing the whole song. And for that reason, tensegrity is considered both a hardware and the software of biology at multiple levels, not just cells, but tissues, bones, and muscles. So it is actually considered the architecture of life.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. So how do you apply that to building a robot?
So basically, I made a tensegrity structure that has 6 rigid elements, 6 of the rods, and 24 stretchy elements. And basically, the structure elements I'm using, they are conductive rubber cords. So you can measure a resistance along the cord, and they can basically tell you how stretched they are. And I want to consider this system as a collective system. So each of these stiff elements, each of the rods will have their own little brain, their own little microcontroller, and their own little goals. And it could be where you have to keep all the rubber cords that are attached to you or within certain resistance boundaries. And that's going to be the happy homeostatic boundaries for each of them. And from there, if you then push the system, if you apply forces on the system, you're going to deform it. And if you push it maybe very far, there's going to be a point, I hope, where the microcontrollers have to decide as a collective whether it's better for them to come back to the original shape or to move maybe to a different shape, because it's going to be better for them to basically meet their lower level requirements. So what I basically want to have is a collective system that has a goal. And each of these little elements in the system will have to make a decision about what to do when forces are applied. So they have to translate these forces to different shapes.
That's really cool. I love this idea. Obviously, there are quite a lot of animals that have this kind of distributed architecture of multiple brains, or whatever you want to call it, neural architecture. Like we've talked about octopuses. I think starfish are also have like a distributed neural whatever architecture. I don't know what the words are.
They do. They have a little like ring of nerves around the mouth, and it's like basically a system of canals, and they move by like hydraulic pressure. So it's very, very distributed again.
But this is not an idea I've heard in robotics at all, I don't think. Like usually it's, there's a central controller and that makes all the decisions. So yeah, it's a really innovative way to approach things.
Yeah, I like distribution, obviously, but I think the power of biology is to have that higher level, maybe one controller, and then at lower level still have some control distributed, offloaded to lower levels. Because in my tensegrity robot, obviously I talked to you about the lower levels, but at the end of the day, my ultimate goal is to then have a higher level. It could be like a central computer connected to the robot, and you're going to have a very big goal, and you're still going to have this lower level goals. And it's going to be a matter of, can this higher level system basically leverage the competency, the goals at the lower level to push the system towards even better shape, or maybe to learn to associate a stimulus with a shape. So there's going to be that, multi-level interactions that I'm hoping to see in systems. And I think that's the power of biology, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that's, that is something that even humans do, right? Like if I think I want to pick up this glass of water, I'm not consciously thinking about every single muscle contraction and how I'm going to achieve that. It's like the goals are in my brain and then my body is doing the rest of it unconsciously.
Exactly, yes. And it's a lot of things that happen both actively and passively at lower levels. Your eyes are doing a kind of pre-processing before it goes to the brain. But even your skin, if you think about your skin, the fact that it's very soft and squishy, it helps when you grasp an object, because there's some passive deformation that help, have that stable grasp around some objects that are quite uneven or with a weird structure or very fragile as well.
So from all of this, what do you think we can learn from octopuses or from other kind of organisms with different intelligence to our own? What can we learn from them to design better robots?
So I really like that question, because obviously octopus intelligence is very different from ours. And when I was in neuroscience, we used very, arbitrary criteria. We tried to understand this criteria for intelligent behavior. And very typical one is, what about having a brain? You need to have a brain to be intelligent. But again, we talked about jellyfish. We talked about flatworm. We talked about all kinds of systems that have a diffuse network of nerve cells, or even single cells that don't have that. And we know they're intelligent. So I think we tend to see intelligence as that very unified thing that we can very easily recognize. So an intelligent system then must have a very centralized structure that reflects that. But the octopus still has a central brain and many brain cells, as many actually neuron as a dog, but they're distributed, which doesn't quite fit. And yet they have behaviors that are very intelligent and very similar to like primates. And they also have the same eye structures as we do. But our common ancestor was a worm. So the question is, how can nature start from very similar building blocks and then end up with us on one hand, but also with massive decentralized systems like octopus? So I think what we can learn from the octopus is about different or maybe hybrid solutions to intelligent behavior. But something I really wanted to say, because that's the power of robotics, I also think that feels like robotics and maybe also synthetic biology can teach us a lot, because from novel systems that we built in robotics, we can maybe better understand what intelligence could also look like in systems that we've never seen before. And I think that's extremely powerful. So I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of this comes back to the fact that we don't really have a very good definition of what we mean by intelligence. Like, obviously there's the whole IQ thing, which has its flaws. And even in humans, we kind of struggle to define exactly what we mean by intelligence. And in this conversation, there's a blurring between intelligence, as I might refer to like my own intelligence, and then like adaptive behavior, which is intelligent in a way, but it's also kind of like it doesn't require a brain. So it kind of starts to pull apart our ideas about what is intelligence. What do we mean by that?
Exactly. I think many people like nowadays agree that intelligence is it's much like a continuum. It's a spectrum, right? It's like every category that we may use to define intelligence, like tool use, having a brain, being able to categorize things, language and all that. It falls on the spectrum. But again, back to my studies in neuroscience, I was once told by a professor, when everybody would tell him, language is what makes us intelligent. But the professor said, if a lion could speak, you would not understand it.
Yeah.
And it's not my professor's, quote. It's actually a quote that is quite famous.
Yeah.
Because we would maybe not be able to recognize intelligence in systems that express intelligence in very, very different ways. So I think building systems that are inspired from nature, but not copy and paste, it's just inspired from principles that we know are good to design intelligent system because there's precedence. But if we then go further than that, and that's what we can do in robotics, and build systems that are unprecedented, that we've never seen before, that we didn't program for, then maybe they will teach us something about intelligence that we would not have been able to recognize otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the same kind of approach in a way as like, creating a computer model to try and understand a system. If you think you know what the key factors are and you put all of them in and it doesn't work, then you've got to go back to the drawing board and think about it again.
Yeah, exactly.
So have you had any thoughts about where you might like to apply these kind of principles? Like I'm thinking in terms of like creating robots that can explore different planets, like these kinds of characteristics might be really useful for that.
Absolutely. So I'm personally interested in resilient robot. And when I say resilient, I don't mean that a robot that if they lose a limb or if they get broken, it's bad and the mission's stopped. I think resilience is it's a homeostatic function. It's a homeostatic process that basically you can have very different set points. So when you lose a limb, you don't have your normal shape. You don't have what you've been programmed for. But if you are made from elements that are themselves very smart, it's not a problem, because you will, instead of investing in brains and finite solutions, you're investing in problem-solving components for your robot. And if these are basically performing homeostasis at their own level, however small it is, they will find a way to make it work. And this is called functional homeostasis. That is to say that it's not always best to come back to what worked previously. Sometimes you're going to find something that will work in a different environment or with a different body or with a different behavior, but it will still function as a solution for intelligence. And that's not just robotics. We know that from life lessons as well, psychology. We know that sometimes letting go of something that used to work but is not working at the moment is maybe better. And if we are good problem solvers and we are showing that resilience, we can maybe find a better set point, a better goal, or better happy boundaries that function best for us. And I think robots should be made of parts that have that intelligence, that intrinsic problem-solving ability.
Yeah.
And that would be great for, as you said, exploring planets, visiting environments that are that we can't access as humans, that are unpredictable and dangerous. It could maybe one day also lead to like a swarm of robots that could go in the body and maybe target cancer cells. So all of that intrinsic bodily intelligence we could maybe leverage to have systems that are much more autonomous, much more resilient, and I think much more intelligent.
Yeah, definitely. So all of this to me is very reminiscent of the idea of morphological computation, which Helmut Hauser first introduced me to in season 3 of Robot Talk, which for listeners who, perhaps didn't catch that episode and aren't familiar, is basically the idea that the structure or the shape of the body can take on some of the computational burden so that the brain doesn't have to think about something for an adaptive behavior to occur. Hopefully that's a reasonable explanation from this non-expert.
I'm sure it's fine. I'm not going to answer that question because he is my supervisor, and if I get this answer wrong, I'll be in trouble for the next 2 years. So I'm not answering that.
I don't want to get you in trouble, but so that was my attempt to explain the concept. So you have started a seminar series called Morpho Talks, which is all about morphological computation. So what is your overall goal with this seminar series?
Yes, actually, I've started that with a friend, with VJ. He's my partner in crime in this whole organization, and also Helmut Hauser is also helping us, and he's, as you said, one of the leading figure in morphological computation. So we have two goals. The first one is maybe a better understanding of what morphological computation is, because when I talk to people, sometimes they say to me, "Oh, okay, morphological computation is just a magic thing, it's a magic trick." Every time you say the body helps, behavior, you're basically throwing this, and this doesn't really mean much. And I do see the point, because even Descartes, the French philosopher, he knew that the body was helping the mind, and he was a dualist. He thought body and mind were completely different. So what we want is basically try to progress and enrich that notion, that concept, by having researchers that are coming from different backgrounds, and reflecting on what this or that system or their results basically tell us about morphological computation and about our own research as well. I basically have friends in the lab that told me, "I'm not sure, the seminars are for me because I'm not working in morphological computation. I don't know if that's going to be helpful for me." But actually, some of them really found that inspiring for their own research, because what it gives you is kind of, it's a lens, it's design principles to think about control computation, about nature principles, about so many things that apply to, I think, all aspects of robotics. So the first aim is to have that progress in these discussions. And the second one is maybe to encourage more collaboration, because we're so interdisciplinary. And my background and experience told me that sometimes you work in very different fields to another scientist or researcher, but you're actually asking the same question. You are referring to the same problems, but with different vocabulary, within a different scope. But it is fundamentally the same question that you're both working on. So I think it's really on that bridge between disciplines that you're going to find interesting things and interesting results, and you're going to think about morphological computation in a very interesting and useful, valuable way.
Yeah, definitely. From what I understand and what I've heard about the concept, like you said, it really does apply very broadly to anybody who's trying to create intelligent systems that move around and interact with the world. So I can see the benefit of that.
Yes.
So these talks are available online. Can you tell listeners where they can find them?
Yes. So we have a website called Morphological Computation. It's basically a website that Helmut Hauser has created. And you have all the details about the upcoming talks. And also you have a link to our YouTube channels, and all the past talks have been recorded. So they're all available on our YouTube channels. And if you also want to give a talk, if you want to attend, if you have any questions, any feedback as well, we also have contact details, and you're welcome to email us anytime. We'll be very happy to hear from you. And we're really looking forward to our next month of talks.
Fantastic. Well, I will pop a link to the YouTube channel in the episode description for listeners who are interested.
Thank you.
Estelle, it's been really fun chatting to you today. I've been talking to Estelle Raffy, a PhD student at the University of Bristol. Thanks, Estelle.
Thanks, Claire. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please do share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review to let us know what you think. And make sure you check out our social media channels to see a photo of the prototype tensegrity robot Estelle and I talked about. We're at Robot Talk Pod on all the socials. Next week, I'm chatting to Steve Benford from the University of Nottingham, all about art, dance, and cat-sitting robots. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.